Matthew 13, he who has ears to hear, let him hear. This now is extending the pattern of Jesus' works and his miracles. And just to put that into the overall outline of the book, we've come here, the third sermon. I would like to explain that in context to what just came just before in Jesus' actions. We noted there conflict with the religious leaders over Jesus' authority, and this conflict growing together with their opposition towards him. Well, what's, I think, happening in the structure of the book is that we're moving from the event, Jesus healing on the Sabbath, people's strong, or the Pharisees' strong rejection of him, now to explain that. And of course, the pattern as we keep on going through the book is that we're going to see this rejection becoming even stronger as the book progresses. But Jesus is going to give a theological grid, a theological explanation for why people are rejecting his ministry and how he's going to respond to that rejection. Within the structure of Matthew 13, it's worth noting that we have a very strong pattern here of parables. And you can just see this if you simply go through and look for the word parable or parables in the book. It's very notable that this is the structure of this chapter. So actually what I've done here is not a search on Matthew 13. I've done a search on the book, the entire book of Matthew. And if you just scroll down through, I'm just trying to show you the number of times we meet the word parables here. There are only a few other times later on in later chapters. So actually 4 instances where we're going to read the word parables outside of Matthew 13. But the other 11 occasions are all occurring right here in this chapter. And that's telling you something. It's telling you that the focus of this chapter is going to be very distinctly and uniquely on the parables. There's something more. You're going to find the concept of the parables, or the pattern with the word parables, as actually the structuring framework for Matthew 13, 8 different parables. And within that structuring framework, you're going to find a pattern twice where Jesus will give the parable a bit later privately to the disciples. He explains the parable. I'll show you that. And we'll see that that really turns out to be the theological key for understanding this chapter. But one other pattern I want to show you before we go there, and that is another pattern with a word or a phrase we can follow, the phrase kingdom of heaven. Again, I'm just searching here Matthew 13, and if you scroll down through or you look through, the number of times we're seeing kingdom or kingdom of heaven it's remarkable. So that's also telling you something about the recurring themes of Jesus' ministry. The kingdom of heaven, pointing to those who arrange themselves, who willingly accept Jesus' reign, and they arrange themselves under his reign, so that they then will inherit all of the blessings of what it's like to be in the kingdom underneath Jesus' good and beautiful reign. Well, the parables are going to link with that now, because we're getting the idea that Jesus is explaining the kingdom of heaven. He's telling you what it's like and what it means to be part of the kingdom of heaven. And he's doing that through the parables. Let's go to the chapter. Let's get the overall view of what's happening in this chapter, the big picture, and just understand on the starting level some of the structure of the chapter so that we can get into the theological themes. So the first parable that you read is the parable of the sower. I think you're familiar with this. It's the responses of different people. The seeds are thrown out generally. Some seed falls on rocky ground, other falls in a place where it's scorched, other falls among thorns, and finally some falls on good soil and produces grain. And Jesus concludes, he who has ears to hear, let him hear. The purpose of the parables follows. Jesus explains why he gives parables. We'll return to this. And then he gives an explanation of the parable of the sower. This is given specifically to the disciples. If we move to the next parable, however, we're going to see the parable of the weeds or the tares. And so this is the idea that the kingdom of heaven, at least at one moment in time, has kind of a mixed reality. You're going to see both wheat and weeds. They're together. And the answer of the master is, well, wait, I'll do the unsorting later. The mustard seed, the concept that the kingdom of heaven is growing, like a mustard seed that then increases and later you see it in all its immensity. Or parallel to that, the kingdom of heaven like leaven, that starts out small, but as the dough is going to rise, you end up with it spread all throughout. Again, you get this idea that there's a pause and a bit of a theological explanation for why Jesus is speaking in parables. We'll return to that later. And then an explanation of the parable of the weeds. So we've had it twice now. The parable of the sower explained, the parable of the weeds explained. The chapter finishes out with a few more parables. This is the kingdom of heaven like a hidden treasure. This is the kingdom of heaven like a pearl. And both of these giving us the idea that to be in the kingdom or to have the kingdom is extraordinarily precious. You should pursue it at any cost. You should be desperate to be part of this kingdom. Also the idea that the kingdom of heaven will be it will be gathered, or people will be gathered, and there will be kind of a sorting. This is what elsewhere we see as the sheep and the goats. God's separating between those who are the good and those who are the bad, those who legitimately belong in the kingdom and those who don't. And the parable here, finally, of Jesus talking about the truth of the kingdom as a treasure. Treasures brought out, both new and old, things that have been prophesied from long ago and things that are more proximate Jesus' teaching. And all of this as treasures. That concludes out the chapter with a shocking response. People asking, well, how can this person, Jesus, possibly be the Messiah? Because we know his family. We're familiar with him. So let's try to put these pieces together and understand a bit of what's happening here and why the emphasis. 4 themes we've already mentioned, but that are critical for us to process for understanding these parables and the chapter. Number 1, you've got to notice the theme of the 2 very different kinds of people. In other words, this is this pattern that we talked about earlier, the wheat and the tares. They're mixed together. A bit later, there's the parable of the fish that are drawn in one net, and within that there's fish that can be used and fish that can't be used, and even things that were just drug up from the bottom. And so there's the sorting of that, and the wheat and the tares, there's the sorting that will come in the final judgment. And it's the idea then that there are 2 very different groups of people within the kingdom. A second theme, the growth of the kingdom. We saw this with the parable of the mustard seed and the leaven. And it's the idea that even though the kingdom is small right now, the kingdom will grow. The kingdom right now, comprised of Jesus and the handful of followers around him, is going to expand until it's going to fill the entire earth. A third theme, the preciousness of the kingdom. This is the parable of the pearl of great price. And that someone would come and seek that kingdom at all costs, to be desperate to enter in and have it. Why? Because you've got to be part of this kingdom. This is a kingdom that you must pursue. And also the treasure hidden in the field. But I want to focus on the 4th and final theme of these that we're talking about. That's the theme of hearing Jesus' words, being willing to listen to all that Jesus said. And this is huge across the parable, across the chapter. In fact, it is the center of this chapter. He who has ears to hear, let him hear, Jesus says. And he uses words like to be given to know, to hear and not to understand, to see and not be able to comprehend. And here he's quoting Isaiah 6, which was a prophecy given against the Jewish people, because though they have functioning ears, they have functioning eyes, they're not able to actually understand. Blessed are your eyes, he says, because they see and they hear. He's saying this to the disciples. And then he's going to explain the parable of the sower. Hear then the parable of the sower. And just a bit later, he who has ears to hear, let him hear. Okay, that actually coming at the end or towards the end of all the parables that Jesus has given. Why is that theme so significant to the chapter? And I think the significance here, to put all of these themes together, is that there's a very definite progression of ideas across the chapter, and all 4 of these themes closely integrated. Those who will listen to Jesus' words, accept, believe, and respond, those are the true. It'll separate the true from the false. Remember the 2 very different kinds of people, that theme. Well, those who will hear Jesus' words and listen are the true. And the result of their hearing and listening is that the true kingdom will grow. And those who then are part of this kingdom will inherit its great, precious, inestimable value. Let's put all the themes together like this. I think you can see here that each of the four themes are integrated, related closely, connected together with really the central core. Are people going to accept Jesus' words? Are they going to turn to him? Will they place their faith in Jesus alone? Actually, this goes further, though, because it's not just that Jesus is giving parables in order to make it either clearer, as in to explain his ideas so that people can understand the complex ideas like a good teacher would make an illustration. Nor is it exactly that he's giving the parables in order to make it more difficult for some people to understand. If you understand the purpose of the parables, Jesus' intention in these parables is actually both. He is at the same time going to cloak or going to make his ideas accessible only to those who actually want to understand what he's saying. And let me show you what I mean by that. Very interesting that right within the passage, you have an explicit statement of the theological purpose of Jesus' parables. The passage itself wants you to know this, or Jesus wants you to know this. And so we read this. The disciples came to him, "Why do you speak to them in parables?" And he answers, "To you it has been given to know the secrets of the kingdom of heaven. To them it has not been given. To the one who has, more will be given. He will have an abundance. The one who has not, even has what he has, will be taken away. That's why I speak to them in parables, because they are not willing to hear, and they are not capable of understanding." The quotation that follows, that we mentioned before, from Isaiah 6, the judgment that came upon Israel for rejecting and refusing the Lord's words. Or a bit later, "Blessed are your eyes because they see, your ears because they hear." He's talking about the disciples, their willingness to hear. Again, just a bit later, Jesus said all of these things to the crowds in parables. He said nothing to them without a parable. That gives you the sense of how often and how much Jesus spoke using parables. This fulfilled another prophecy, and it's the prophecy that the Messiah will speak in parables, both exposing or revealing or making clearer, but also bringing about judgment. And if we're putting that then into the framework of everything else we have in this chapter, it gives me a very helpful explanation for understanding what exactly is going on here. The purpose of the parables actually differs based on the hearers. For those who reject, for those who have no interest in actually hearing and understanding, the parables make Jesus' teaching a lot of confusion. Well, there's no way to understand these. He speaks in riddles. It's as though he's hiding everything and making it complex, some kind of code that you have to break. Why doesn't he just tell us what he's intending to say? But for those who are willing to listen, Jesus' parables bring illumination and clarity. Now, how could I really support that, or how could we say that? Because they're all both standing there, they're hearing the same thing, aren't they? And so how then could one group understand and the other group still remain confused? The answer here is that Jesus is going to give a specific or special explanation for those who are willing to listen. And again, that appears in the passage explicitly stated for a distinction between the disciples and the Pharisees. Watch how he's going to address the disciples specifically. He speaks to them saying, "Hear then the parable of the sower," and he gives an explanation to them at length. Okay, but if you're going to roll further up in the context, you can recognize that this is an explanation that's given privately to the disciples. If you move further down in the passage, you see a similar thing happening with the tares. He left the crowds, he went into the house, and the disciples came to him saying, "Explain to us the parable of the weeds of the field." And Jesus explains it, but it's private, particularly explained to them. And all of this is illustrating the overall framework for parables and for Matthew chapter 13. If you are a person who comes to Jesus, and your intention is to reject him, you're not going to listen anyway. Your intention is to try to falsify what he says, find problems, criticize, attack. Then Jesus follows his own principle to not cast pearls before swine. You're not interested in listening. But to a person who's willing to come and who wants to hear, Jesus will teach. Jesus will explain. What's the difference between the two? And it goes back to the opening theme that we recognized, one of the most often repeated concepts in this chapter. The person who has ears to hear, let him hear. Right at the beginning, he who has ears to hear, let him hear. All throughout in the middle, those who have ears and they will understand, hear. Those who will hear and listen, and finding the conclusion, he who has ears to hear, let him hear. The point of the parables and the point of this chapter is if you are willing to come to Jesus with a listening heart, if you are willing to accept what he tells you, Jesus will give you grace. Jesus will teach you. The chapter ends with a very interesting summary and just an illustration of this same principle that we've already seen. When Jesus had finished all of these parables, he went away from there. He came to his hometown. He taught them in their synagogue. And the people's response to this, where did this man get this wisdom and these mighty works? It helps me a little bit to visualize or just to understand what's happening here and recognize the geography of the place. As best we understand, this would be Nazareth, not Capernaum. This is placed in the area or the region of Galilee where Jesus did most of his ministry, Judea, Jerusalem. That's where he's going to ultimately be tried and die. But this region is more, well, it's more distant. It's going to also include Samaritans and Gentiles. And we're recognizing that this region where Jesus did most of his ministry, he received a lot of response to his ministry. People willing to hear his words. The further context here helps me just to visualize. We actually have, there are remains, or there is a structure still in Nazareth. A church has been built over it, but we can probably identify the synagogue. And you can look at, or you can see a reconstruction of the Nazareth synagogue. This is not the actual one. This is a group that has kind of rebuilt what we suspect a synagogue would have looked like on the outside. And you can see the inside, kind of the idea of a small room, an area where people are sitting around the outside edges. It's going to be dark. You're, of course, not going to have electric lighting, but you're going to do your best, people sitting around, and there's going to be reading. Very simple structure with somebody sitting at a table reading in front of the group. So all of this as an expression of Jesus' ministry to the people in Nazareth, and a picture of what it would be like to actually be there and to see some of this. But the point of it is that Jesus Christ coming to Nazareth is actually rejected. People aren't willing to listen. They aren't willing to take seriously his words. And their response is specifically because they know him. The question they have is, where did this man get this wisdom and these mighty works? We know his father. We know his mother. We know his brothers. We know his sisters. Then where then did this man get all these things? And I think what this highlights for us is that it's not really even as simple as saying that Jesus comes and the poor or the needy accept him, and those then who are in the high elite status reject him. You might find some surprises. You might even find the people that know Jesus best won't listen. And that's because the core and central focus of Matthew and of the Gospels and the story of people's rejection of Jesus is that it depends on their hearts. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. Jesus came to his own, and they rejected him. And even when it comes to his own hometown and his own people, they turn away from him. Of course, the question then to all of us, are we willing to read carefully through the parables, seek to understand them, struggle through the details, and look with a diligent and careful eye at what Jesus has said? To the challenge for all of us, do we have ears to hear? From Matthew 13 in the book of Matthew, he who has ears, let him hear. Listen to what Jesus has spoken.